Hi everybody, thank you for joining us and welcome to this Trying to Conceive webinar. Now when you're going through fertility struggles, it is of course only natural to ask, why me? We know that searching for answers and trying to achieve the desired outcome can take its toll on your emotional health. So we're delighted to welcome Chien, a specialist fertility counsellor, to give us her expert opinion on the best way to look after ourselves during what can seem like an emotional roller coaster. Hi Anne.
Hi Heather.
Thank you very much for coming along tonight.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now we're going to begin this webinar tonight with Anne's presentation, and then we're going to move on to a Q&A session. Feel free to type in any questions that you think of as we go. We will come back to them once Anne's presentation has finished. Now, if you want to submit a question, just hover your cursor down at the bottom of your screen and a toolbar will appear. If you go into Q&A and then type away your question, just make sure that you select the anonymous function, because we don't want to disclose any of your personal details, and this will be recorded and it will be watched by others later. Okay, all that remains for me to do now is to disappear and to say good luck, Anne. Enjoy yourself.
Thank you. Me today. I hope everybody can hear me. What I'm going to do tonight is just tell you a little bit about counselling, fertility counselling, talk about the impact it can have on people, which I'm sure many of you are aware of yourselves, and talk about some clients' experiences, and then go on to talk about different, what we call therapeutic interventions, to try and help you with what you're going through. So just to start off, I'd like to tell you a little bit about counselling, what counselling is. It can be quite difficult to describe. So counselling and psychotherapy are umbrella terms that cover quite a range of talking therapies. They're delivered by trained practitioners who work with people over a short or long term and help them bring about change, which makes them hopefully feel better in the long term. And that's the definition from the British Association of Counsellors and Psychotherapists. We're all members of BACP. We have to be members, and we also, to work in fertility, we have to be accredited members. So just to let you know that the counsellors working in the units are all highly experienced because they are accredited. Infertility counselling, this is the British Infertility Counselling Association definition of counselling. And again, it's just to let patients have an opportunity to talk about their thoughts, feelings and beliefs in relation to their fertility difficulties, talk about their relationships, trying to help them understand a bit more the meaning of what they're going through, and in particular implications of specific types of treatment that they may be having. It can also offer support to people as they're going through treatment and help them to accommodate feelings about the outcome of any treatment. So within infertility counselling, there's actually 3 different types of counselling, which is quite unique in counselling. So there's the therapeutic counselling, implications, which are specific for things like if somebody's using a donor, sperm donor or egg donor, or for people who might be considering surrogacy arrangements. And there's also the supportive counselling. So that's supportive as people are going through any form of treatment. Our regulatory body within fertility is the HFEA, which some of you may be familiar with. And there are legal requirements that within all units offering any kind of treatment in the UK for fertility, it's a mandatory requirement for everyone, all patients, to be given a suitable opportunity to receive proper counselling. And that's from somebody who's suitably qualified and experienced as a counsellor to be working within fertility. Referrals have to be routinely offered for counselling before any treatment, and for implications counselling there's a minimum of 2 to 3 sessions which are expected to be offered. If somebody's coming through for a known donor or a surrogacy arrangement, then there will be a few more sessions expected for the implications counselling. And within all the units in Scotland, there's an unlimited maximum number of sessions for counselling available. That may vary depending on whether you're in different areas of the UK and whether it's private or NHS centre that you're having your treatment in. So we all live in a world with assumptions, and we believe our world is safe and secure. If we didn't believe that kind of assumption, then we wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. So we all have these assumptions. The assumptive rule about pregnancy is quite deeply rooted. We all assume, maybe not everybody wants to conceive and have a family, but most people assume that they will get pregnant at some point. If your assumptive world is shattered, then you're most likely to have some kind of psychological reaction to that. And this will mean that your world won't be as safe and secure as you thought it was, and it may take time before it restores again. Society expects people to go on and have family, and especially in Western society, and many women live their lives against a background of personal and cultural assumptions that all women are or want to be mothers at some point, and that for women, motherhood is proof of being an adult, and it's often a natural consequence of marriage or a permanent relationship with a man. When that's proven to be difficult to achieve, and it requires medical interventions, then it can become a major life challenge for many people. It can have an impact on individuals. Infertility is considered to be a chronic stressor, so it's something that develops slowly but is continuous, and it's not always resolved by medical interventions, as some of you may know. So it's something that can go on, the stress can kind of build up over a period of time. So when you first start to try to conceive, then you may start off with the hope that you're going to fall pregnant within the next month or the next month. And then with time, it becomes more and more difficult. So the stress levels begin to build up, and it continues over a period of time. So it becomes a chronic stressor. It's something that we can't control. So often you don't know what to do to help the situation if you've got fertility problems. Can't influence the outcome of the situation. You can't ensure that any treatment will be successful. So you have very little control over the situation, and it can be very stressful in that you don't have much control. Infertility is a deep grief. It challenges the meaning of lives. There's a loss of expectations, that expectation to have a family, and it can create a crisis. What is life about if parenthood isn't possible? For many people, that's extremely difficult to deal with. And it can make you feel quite vulnerable. Why is this happening to me? It doesn't make sense. There could be a loss of reproductive potential, and that's a loss of a part of the self, loss of expectations and life possibilities. So it can have a huge impact on individuals, and it can be difficult to adjust to this psychologically. And that could be difficult even if there's some kind of diagnosis, like a low sperm count, blocked tubes, and you can also be difficult to adjust psychologically to any treatment that might follow. So there may be that loss of the healthy body, the loss of the dream of being parents when you begin to struggle and have some difficulties, loss of control over the future, what's going to happen, so really quite out of your control. The medical interventions that we can offer can provide some hope, give you a sense of hope at the beginning, but depending on where you live, they can become quite expensive, as some people may know. They can be more difficult, more complicated than you might expect at the outset. Sometimes they can be unsuccessful, and obviously they can increase the amount of stress that people feel that they're under. So it's well known that to have difficulties with fertility can be an emotional roller coaster. There's that cycle of hope and despair that we're familiar with. So when you first start to conceive naturally, for example, in the middle of the month, when you think you may be ovulating, if you know what your cycle's doing, you may feel, well, it's hopeful, we might conceive this month, and you might give it a try. And then when your period comes at the end of the month, then you feel that despair. So you're going up and down emotionally every single month that you're trying to conceive. If there are fertility problems, then it can challenge the beliefs that we have about ourselves and the world around us. So you believe that you're going to be parents or a parent, and there's expectations from others around you. So your belief is that at some point you may have family, and if that's difficult, then that will really challenge the beliefs that you have around family. It can be very demanding to have difficulties with fertility, Especially during treatment, it can be very difficult physically because of all the medications that we use for treatments like IVF. It can be very demanding sexually, financially, and it can become socially isolating. So sexually, it often becomes about trying to conceive rather than having fun within a relationship. And it can become quite mechanical, and it increases stress levels. Financially, depending on where you live, it can become very expensive. There can be extra additional costs for things like travelling to and from hospitals for treatment, so just extras that you may not have thought about. And socially isolating, it can become socially isolating because it makes you think of the people that you want to be with. If you're with people who have family or are pregnant, then sometimes many, especially females, can find it very difficult to be in situations socially where there are people around who are maybe talking about babies, talking about pregnancies, or in social media, for example. And what often happens is you start to step back from a little bit to take care of yourself, and you can become a little bit more isolated. So it's a bit of a vicious circle, really, because support's really important, but you're pulling back from people. To experience it can also challenge your personal coping strategies. So you may have strategies that you use in different situations that are quite effective, but when it comes to dealing with something that is really something that you probably don't know how to cope with, it can really challenge how do you deal with what you're going through. And it can accentuate the pressure of cultural, religious, or gender differences. When I think about this, I think about people whose beliefs, due to religious beliefs, they may be disagree with things like infertility treatment and the creation of embryos, or for people from religions such as Muslims, when it comes to using donors, then again, that goes against their cultural and religious beliefs. So it can really put a lot of pressure on in many different ways. Some couples can experience a strain in their relationship because of what they're going through and putting pressure onto each other. For some, unfortunately, it can be a threat to a relationship. Most people are able to talk to the partners, but when you think about males and females, on the whole, usually females prefer to do the talking a bit more, and the men are often quite practical. So we are different. So the men will perhaps try to do something to help out, whereas the women need that emotional support and need to talk about things. And that can be tricky in a relationship. Sometimes the men will say in the counselling that they're tired of hearing the partner talking about fertility problems or talking about treatment constantly. But women need to have that release of emotion. So it's about, certainly within counselling, agreeing with each of them to allow one person to talk, the other to learn how to listen. And even if that means having boundaries where maybe 20 minutes a night, you decide that you will sit down and talk about it, and then that's it for the evening, say after work, then you need that space to be able to talk about things. But it can be difficult because there are differences between us. Some research from Schmitz in 2006 shows that 27% of women and 22% of men identified having communication difficulties even before their first treatment. And if men are unable to talk to their partners, it can result for some in significant risk of women developing low mood and depression, and that's research from 2009. Sadly, it can make or break relationships in some cases. So to go through fertility difficulties, it's a loss. It's a loss of your expectations. It's a loss of that family that you probably dearly want. There are many layers to the grieving and the loss, but it's really important that you consider grieving and name it as grieving when you're going through fertility difficulties. There can be different types of losses. There can be change in relationships and friendships, and that kind of goes back to what I said earlier about with relationships, you may step back from some friends, especially if they're pregnant and it's difficult to be around them because it's too upsetting to be with them because of what you're going through. There is often a strong feeling of envy when somebody else is pregnant or announces a pregnancy. And I think because you feel vulnerable, you start to be like a radar where you're even more sensitive to people around you who may be pregnant or have young babies or families. So it can be very upsetting. So you may choose to kind of step back from some friendships and some family members because it's just too upsetting. There can be losses physically or mental losses. So it could be that, you know, during the investigations that might be done for fertility problems, they may find that there's something like a blocked tube, or they may find that there's something like low sperm count. There may be some kind of physical loss. And obviously the mental loss would be something like low mood or anxiety. There can be losses around the finances, the cost of the finances, as I kind of mentioned earlier. And there can be other losses, the loss of childlessness, and sometimes people put things like their career on hold if they've got opportunities for promotion. They may say, you know, it's not the time to apply for that promotion because I'm hoping to get pregnant, and they'll put things off, put their lives on hold. So there's several kind of different types of losses that sometimes it's helpful just to be aware of and to kind of consider what's going on in your personal life. It's important to be aware of the normal grief process, and this is a well-recognised definition from Kubler-Ross in 1969. It's used in many ways for loss, as in bereavement, and also if there's a physical health problem, then we use the same stages of grief process for these things, and it fits very well when it comes to fertility difficulties as well. So it's important that when you are having fertility problems, that you are actually going in and out of these different stages. And that is difficult, and it's very, very emotional to do that, but it's also normal to be experiencing these different stages. And these stages, going in and out of them, are another reason why it becomes so emotional and so difficult. So there may be the stage of denial, and that's, I can't believe this is happening to us. Why is this happening to us? And it doesn't make sense. It can be anger, frustration, it's not fair. Again, why is this happening to us? We're doing all the right things, and we're healthy, we're trying our very best, and you know, you can feel quite envious of maybe somebody who isn't taking care of themselves in the way that you may be doing, and think, well, how come they've got pregnant and it's been so difficult, or it is so difficult for us to conceive? So there can be a lot of anger around in different ways. There can be the bargaining stage, and that's the what if. What if I try this? Will this help us to conceive? And there can be lots of what ifs. There's lots of things out there. People with fertility difficulties are vulnerable. If you hear about something, you will probably want to try anything to try and conceive. And when you think about that, you need to think about what we call treatment add-ons. Often there's no evidence to support some of these other add-ons. As I say, you probably want to try anything if you think that that's going to give you a small chance of conceiving. So often there's these, what if we try this, or what if we do this? Will it make it different? Will we get pregnant? It's important also to feel sad, to cry. It's really important to have crying times, to set aside time where you do cry, you do think about what you're going through, and you allow yourself to express some of these emotions. You allow yourself to express the anger as well. And that's finding ways, whether it's going out and walking and stamping your feet just to release some of that anger. But it's important that you go in and out of all these different stages, because that's a normal grieving process. So it is difficult, but I think just if you're able to name it and recognise that that's what's going on for you. The final stage of acceptance, while you're going through fertility investigations and treatment, that's less likely that you're going to accept what you're going through. That would come with time. And that might take, as some of you may know, quite a long period of time before you begin to accept. Sometimes people never accept what they've gone through, depending on the outcome. So these are all the healthy stages of the grieving process. And I think it's important just to think about them and recognise them within yourself and become familiar with them, and allow yourself to feel this way so that you can cope with the fertility difficulty that you're faced with. So to have problems with fertility may feel like a life crisis, and a crisis is when we perceive something that's happening to be difficult, and that we don't have the immediate available resources and coping mechanisms to be able to cope with it. So we don't know what to do, we don't know how to cope with it. And these low control stressors, so the stressors that we don't have much control over, can lead to repeated life crises. So it can feel like it's going on and on and on. And it can then lead to increased levels of anxiety and depression. So when we feel as if we're in crisis, we feel as if we're not in control of the situation and we're not able to cope with the situation. We can't fix it, we don't know what to do. So we feel a bit hopeless and we become demoralised and feel more isolated, as I mentioned earlier on. We can have very strong emotional responses. So you can feel more emotional than you might in a different situation. So you can feel very angry, you can feel very frightened, and you can also feel numb if you feel a bit overwhelmed with the situation. It can impair our decision making, so sometimes we can be quite irrational and sometimes think the worst of situations, catastrophising things. So it can have a significant impact on us when we feel as if our life's in crisis and we can't control the situation. Many people who are experiencing fertility difficulties experience low mood, and that often goes hand in hand with anxiety, which I will go on to talk about. So referral for treatment, any investigations and any actual treatment itself can make you feel anxious, and not knowing what the outcome's going to be of things like treatment can lead to low moods. So it's that sense of being out of control, feeling sad, feeling helpless and hopeless at times, and it can bring your mood down, and especially if it's going on over a long period of time. Some of the research by Berhack in 2007 shows that women's emotional adjustment shows women going through fertility difficulties don't differ from normal groups with respect to depression or low mood before treatment. But studies have shown that there's an increased risk of depression, especially if you have repeated unsuccessful cycles. More research from 2008, women identified as 2 or 3 times more likely to have depressive symptoms when they're struggling with fertility. So about 30% of women will have difficulties with low mood while they're going through any treatment or investigations. And 14.8% of women, 5.7% of men develop depressive symptoms 1 year after unsuccessful treatment. And again, that's from some of the recent research. When you feel low and sad, again, I think it's important to just be aware that this is often a normal reaction considering what you're going through. So again, it doesn't feel good. But I think it's important to try and recognise it so that maybe you can try to prevent some of these symptoms and you can be more aware of what this low mood is like and the impact it has on you and your lives. So it can be that you can't be bothered doing things, you don't have much energy, you just can't be bothered, you're lying on the couch, you're not interested in things, so your motivation's not as good as it might usually be. Emotionally, there's the sadness that I've already mentioned, the low mood. Don't enjoy things as much as you might have done if you weren't going through this. And you might feel empty because there's an obvious emptiness in your lives that you're struggling to fill, and that's to have that family that you dearly want to have. There can be cognitive impairments, and that might be things like, common one is your concentration might not be as good as it might normally be, or you might be a bit more forgetful. You can see yourself quite negatively, things like I'm not good enough, I'm a bit of a failure, this isn't working, and you can feel quite negative about the future. What's the future going to be like? Because there's that uncertainty that you're living with, which can be very difficult. The unfairness of the world, why is this happening to me? So many kind of negative thoughts and feelings can be around. Behaviourally, you can withdraw from any hobbies or interests, or socially, as I mentioned earlier, you can become quite isolated, or you can become quite demanding and needy and want to be with other people, so it can go either way. And biologically, your sleep can often be disturbed because your head might be full with all that you're going through. Your appetite might not be the same, or you might comfort eat, you might go to the other extreme. And there might be a loss of interest in sex, which goes against what you're trying to do, which is quite sad. And sex can become quite mechanical because it becomes about trying to have a baby rather than having fun in the relationship. So it's got a different meaning. And yet it's really important for many people to continue trying to conceive naturally, but that's something that often becomes quite difficult. When we feel anxious, it's the experience of fear which has taken over the actual sense of whatever that danger might be to us. And there's a fine line between what's normal fear and sensible fears and what is anxiety, and it may be inappropriate for that situation that you're faced with. Some of our fears have survival value and help us to cope and help us to do things, while others just make us feel like the rabbit in the headlights. Some of you may be familiar with the fight or flight term. That's a normal body response. Hormones are released, adrenaline's released, and that's a mechanism to tell the body you're feeling threatened by something. You either need to fight back or get out of there, flight, and protect yourself. So when you think back to cavemen days, that was a really useful response to have. And as I say, it's a natural body response. So cavemen would go out with their spear, they would have to fight for their dinner that night, literally to have food on the table. If the animal was too big, then that adrenaline would be released and your body would be saying, this animal's too big, it's dangerous, get out of here, so that you survive. But if it's small enough and they were able to kill that animal for their dinner, then you would fight back and use your spear. So it's a response that we have. But nowadays, that's actually sometimes not helpful in some of the situations we're faced with, and certainly with fertility, sometimes it's not helpful, and it feels difficult when you're feeling anxious, and sometimes you feel more anxious than you might want to given the situation that you're in. The anticipation of problems that we have in the future, we can feel quite anxious about, I'm going to fail, what if this treatment doesn't work? You can feel quite anxious about that. I'll look stupid, so that could be something like if you're coming in for some kind of scan, for example, and you feel a bit embarrassed about having some of these invasive procedures done, then sometimes you feel you might feel stupid, or you might embarrass yourself. You might think, how am I going to be able to cope? So all of these kind of thoughts make you feel quite anxious at times, depending on the situation. When we're feeling anxious, we often use what we call safety behaviours, thinking that they're going to be helpful, but sometimes they can just exacerbate the anxiety that we're feeling. So if we feel threatened or feel as if we're in danger, sometimes we avoid situations. So you may, as I said earlier, you may avoid friends if you're feeling threatened. Some people just bury their heads in the sand. Maybe it will just all go away. And when we feel anxious after things like embryo transfer, then you may find that you're doing things like frequently going back and forward to the toilet to check to see if there's any bleeding, to make sure it's okay. And again, that's a safety behaviour, and it's because you're feeling anxious following something like embryo transfer. So the counselling can be really helpful. It can help you to explore some of these things that I've mentioned to you, explore some of your thoughts and feelings. And it's helpful, it helps us to try and understand, how do individuals cope? What kind of strategies are you using to help you to cope with the difficult situation that you're faced with fertility problems and any investigations or treatment you may have? The counsellor would probably ask something like, what's helping you at the moment? What's not helping you? And it's important to think, if you've got a partner, how is your partner coping? And how are you coping? What are the differences between you? And often that can be quite different. I think especially if it's a heterosexual relationship, the men are able to often go to their work, switch off from it, whereas the women are still very aware of, if they're having treatment, for example, what's going on in their bodies at every single moment of the day, and it's difficult to switch off from that. So you cope differently when going through things like treatment. So it's important to kind of explore what helps, what's helping you at the moment, what's not helping you. It's helping you to maybe avoid some of these people, friends that you know who are pregnant, and it doesn't help to be with those people, some people who are pregnant who are causing you distress or upset. So it's just exploring different things. For some, sadly, it may be about therapeutically working through some difficulties from, for example, childhood. It may be that there's a history of sexual or childhood abuse. And obviously when it comes to treatment investigations, because of the nature of what we're doing, then that can be particularly difficult for some people, and we need to use, be be sensitive and use different techniques, and give a lot of support in that kind of situation. So there may be a history of some difficulties that are making it even more complicated when it comes to attending the units. We would try to increase the reality of any loss by encouraging clients to talk about what does it feel like, what do the losses feel like, what are the losses, try and identify all these different layers of losses that people experience with fertility difficulties. Sometimes it may be sharing scan photographs to bring back memories and feelings, and that can be quite upsetting initially, but it also can be quite therapeutic and helpful for many people. Counsellors would allow individuals to identify and talk about and express their feelings. We use different techniques to get people to try to share their feelings. Within the counselling room, it's completely confidential. The counsellors are working within a team, but we're working independently within those teams. So we're not allowed to talk about what we talk about in the counselling room, and that's just the way we work in counselling. So if you want to express anything like anger or frustration, if you want to just sit and cry in the counselling room, then that's the place to do it. It's a safe space to do it. And a lot of these emotions, as I've mentioned earlier, are normal responses to feeling helpless in the situation, perhaps feeling guilty, and of course experiencing those losses. We can help you to, through the counselling, increase your awareness and understanding of what that loss means to you, helping you to talk about it. What are the consequences of the loss? And sometimes it's things like, we were hoping to move house, or we have moved house, we moved into a family home, we don't have that family. What does that mean to you? What's that like for you? Do we buy a new car? What kind of car do we buy? Do we buy a family car, or what do? We don't know what to do. It's difficult to continue with life when you're dealing with fertility difficulties. What if there's promotion at work? Do we apply for that promotion? But often clients are hoping to conceive, so maybe it's not the time to apply for a job. Are you missing opportunities? So there are lots of things can go on that we can help you to explore and try and make sense of. We would explore how are you coping, making sense of things, reminding you that we've got an inner strength. We've all got that in difficult times. It always appears, that inner strength that we've got, that helps us through. And hopefully just in recognising that you can get through this with the right kind of support, it may help you to recognise that you're stronger than you think and help you to increase your self-esteem. We can share the information on what's a normal course of reactions to loss, which I've already mentioned, the grieving process, and just let you recognise that if you've got that support there, then that is extremely beneficial if you've got it. Really, really important. And accept loss, the grief, as a natural response to any losses that you've got. So it's okay to grieve. It's giving you permission to feel all these different emotions and to share them and express them with somebody that you feel safe to do that with. Within the counselling, it can be either individuals or couples coming in for the counselling, whatever works and whatever feels it would be helpful. If it's a couple, then we would encourage communication between couples in some situations, and also encourage to accept that there are differences between us, between males and females, for example, or just differences between individuals. So just allowing you to recognise that, but to help you to find a way to cope with what you're both going through if you're in a couple, and find more effective ways of coping with a very, very difficult life event. So the purpose of infertility counselling is to reflect upon and understand some of the implications of some of the treatments that we offer, and that's more specific things like donor treatment, offering to be a donor, and surrogacy arrangements. These are quite unique ways of working in counselling, and what you might find is that the counsellor does most of the talking and shares a lot of information in relation to what the implications might be if you choose one of these treatment options, and it would be a lot of sharing information. So the counsellors often do a lot more talking when it comes to implications counselling, which is quite unusual for us because usually we're there to listen, and we would encourage the client to talk more if that's what's going to help them. We can provide emotional support either before, during or after any treatment. Before treatment, it depends on the unit that you're attending, but certainly I know in the unit that I work in Dundee, Sometimes we get referrals from GPs, and it may be young women who have been diagnosed with things like Turner syndrome when they're maybe 16, 17 years old. And very occasionally, I'll certainly be asked by the GPs if I can support that young woman at that stage. So they may not be thinking about having family, but they need support to think about their fertility, because that's quite overwhelming for somebody in that, especially in that age group. So it can be before treatment starts. So maybe if you've been referred to your unit, it can be when before the treatment itself actually starts. And we're beginning to think that it might actually be quite useful to attend counselling, just to meet the counsellor, talk to the counsellor. How are you coping? Do you feel you're going to cope with this? Talk a little bit about what might be ahead, and just almost like ensure that you've got some coping strategies that will help you through this difficult situation. The counselling can also be during any treatment, and that might be more like support through treatment, which can be very stressful and difficult to go through. And I think before you enter into treatment, nobody actually knows what it's actually like and how difficult it can actually be. So that support's available. And it can be after treatment, depending on the outcome. Certainly, if you've got a positive outcome as well, pregnancies can often be quite an anxious time. And again, some counsellors can offer some support, not on a weekly basis due to the demands of the services, but maybe occasionally just to support you through some pregnancies, depending on the individual situation. So it's worth checking out with the counsellor in the unit that you're attending whether that's a possibility or not, and whether you feel that it might be beneficial for you or not. So the support is there at all stages, and it's a legal requirement that that support is offered to you in all units in the UK. We can assist people to help develop coping strategies to help you in the short and long term with the consequences of any fertility treatment. So that's things about thinking about coping strategies. What do you do to distract yourself if you've got a lot of negative thoughts around? They can often take over. You can catastrophize. They can be unhelpful. You can think about previous experiences and relate that to what's happening in the present, and that can be really unhelpful. It's really important to remember that you're in the moment. So if you're having, for example, a second attempt at treatment, it's going to be very different to what happened the first time. You can't compare, so it will be different. So what do you do to take care of yourself to help you cope with the difficulty, to try and reduce the stress levels? What kind of hobbies, interests have you got that will act as a kind of buffer for the stress that's going to hit you, because you know it's going to be stressful and you go up and down as you go through treatment, and that's natural. We can offer up help people try to adjust with your particular situation, depending on that what the situation is. And we can talk about, well, what can you control in this situation? Often you feel quite out of control about the outcome. It can feel a bit like a lottery at times. And you can literally, in some situations, you can put all the money on it that you want, but it doesn't obviously and sadly guarantee the outcome. So you can feel out of control regarding the outcome of any treatment. But what can you do that gives you a sense of control? And that's thinking about in the moment to moment, what kind of things are you in control of? And not forgetting that every moment of the day we are in control of our situations. So it's just reminding you, yes, you are in control of many things. And just helping you to recognise that. So just to kind of tell you very briefly and come to the end of the talk, there are various ways that counsellors work with individuals. We have lots of different types of therapeutic approaches. There's actually about 430 therapeutic approaches, believe it or not. Many of us use a variety of different approaches. Some of these will be things that you'll recognise, like cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT, person-centred approach, psychodynamic approach. There are many, many approaches that we can use. And it depends on the counsellor, what their training has been in. And I often think, well, what does this individual client need? What might work best? And that's why it's almost like we've got a little toolbox of different approaches that we can use, and hopefully we'll find one that will be effective for the individual client. The therapeutic relationship is extremely important so that you feel safe, you've got that trust in the counsellor who's working with you. You can come into the counselling feeling very anxious to begin with, and that's a natural reaction. And it's just about building that relationship up, which can take 3 to 4 sessions, and that's to make you feel safe so that you can talk about whatever you need to talk about. And don't forget what I said about the confidentiality. The counselling is completely confidential. If there were any concerns about any risk to yourself or somebody else, and somebody else that we think about in the units all the time is obviously the welfare of the child, because of what we're trying to do. So if there were any concerns, we would say, if it was appropriate, we maybe need to speak to one of the team, but generally it's completely confidential with the counsellor, and that's really important to know so that you can feel safe and build up that relationship with your counsellor. The counselling can be face-to-face, so you would come into the units and see the counsellor in the counselling room. Occasionally it can be via Skype, or it can be via telephone if there's distance involved. Some counsellors can offer group work, can be quite effective to meet others who are going through something similar. And we can use different techniques. We can be quite creative. Some counsellors are using things like art therapy. We'll encourage you to bring in photos. To keep a diary of what you're going through can be very effective. We often encourage you to use a diary just to write down the thoughts and feelings that are going through your head when things are particularly difficult. So that's the kind of negative thoughts and feelings that may be around. So if you write them down in a diary, then you've still got them, but you've hopefully emptied your head a little bit and given you a little bit of space, because it can be quite overwhelming sometimes because the negative thoughts take over. We might encourage you to write letters or cards. If there's been a miscarriage, an early pregnancy loss, then sometimes it's helpful to think of ways that we can mark that loss and grieve, have some kind of ceremony. Everybody's different, but we can use different techniques. Sometimes it's about just thinking about, okay, what can I do to mark this loss? Do I get a piece of jewellery that I can wear, that may be a charm bracelet, that may be something to remind me of that loss? Or do I get a plant or put something in the garden so that I can nurture a plant? There are various ways that we can kind of share with you that you can, if you've experienced loss during treatment or prior to treatment, then we can discuss that with our clients and help you to kind of maybe find something that feels right. But often to mark the losses can be very helpful. Sometimes you think, is it okay to mark that loss? Have I got a right to mark that loss? Well, yes, you do. It's really important to help you to cope with whatever difficulty you're going through. So that's just been a quick oversight of all the things that I wanted to share with you this evening. Please don't forget, these are all normal responses. They can be extremely difficult. It can feel like that emotional roller coaster. It's not an easy experience to go through, as I'm sure many of you know. But these are normal responses and reactions that many, many women and men have when you're going through fertility difficulties. And you're not going bonkers. Some people will say that's what it feels like. It's really important that you think of ways to take care of yourself, that you recognise all these thoughts and feelings, and if you want some help, remember that the counsellors are there in every unit, and that's what our job's for. And I think that because we've got counsellors in every unit in the UK, to me that just speaks volumes. You don't get counsellors working in every department elsewhere in the NHS, for example, so there is a need for it. We know it's difficult to go through fertility difficulties, and that's what we're there for. We're there to support you. So please contact your counsellor if you feel that you need to speak to somebody. And thank you very much for listening tonight.
Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for that. I mean, you just covered so many points that so many will relate to, and it really is good to know that these responses are quite normal, actually.
Yeah, I think people forget that.
I think so too. Now, the first question that I've got for you is, do you find that couples say that they don't talk to each other enough for that fear of upsetting each other by saying the wrong thing?
Absolutely, that comes up time and time again in the counselling. It's like you're trying to protect each other. You don't want to upset each other. So often it's very difficult to talk about these things. If we know that one of those couples do have a difficulty, if there's something that's been diagnosed, for example, like blocked tubes or low sperm count, then the other person in that relationship may not want to place blame onto the other partner or upset them in any way, so it can be very, very difficult to talk about.
So it's only natural, really, to want to protect each other.
Yeah. But it's important to find a way, I think, to talk about these things. And if it feels safe in the counselling room to do that to begin with, then that's what the counsellor would hopefully help with and encourage couples to do. And as I said earlier, create that space, maybe 20 minutes in an evening if that works out for you as a couple. But set aside the time to be able to talk about things. It's really, really important.
Okay, thank you. Now, when someone is so emotionally exhausted through having fertility treatment, it must be very, very difficult to then suggest successful coping strategies such as continuing hobbies, etc., that obviously require a bit of effort.
Yeah, absolutely. It's difficult to motivate yourself because your motivation can feel as if it's not as good as it would normally be. So we would encourage you just to not overdo it, just take a sense of control again. This is something that you can do in the situation that you're in, and that in itself can be quite empowering. But to just think small. It's not about running a marathon, definitely not about that. It's maybe just about go for a walk twice a week. So it's almost like you would set homework. When we're using CBT techniques, we call it homework. So you have to structure in these things. They're really important. And it may be something as simple as having a hot bath or listening to some music. So it doesn't have to be anything that's really going to exert you and exhaust you more than what you perhaps already are feeling. It can be small things, but really, really important things to help you cope and distract you from often these negative thoughts that are really quite unhelpful and are like a kind of downward spiral often.
Okay. Right, let's have a look at some of the questions that have come in. One of them is, how do I try not to feel like it's my fault?
I think that's difficult, and certainly if I've got a couple who are here for counselling, then I would say it takes two to try and conceive. It's both of you trying to conceive, don't forget that. Try not to blame each other. You both want to have family together, and it's about supporting each other through whatever process you're going through when it comes to things like treatment. So it's not forgetting that you're trying to do this together. You want to be parents together, and ultimately, if the treatment's successful, then that's what you're aiming for.
Okay, thank you. The next one says, talking about depression and anxiety or low mood, is there any advice on how to deal with this at work or with your employer? If you're needing time off from work, is that something that's common to deal or cope with these feelings, that you need to speak to your employer about what's going on?
It depends. It can be difficult when it comes to you thinking about your job and employment. It depends on your manager. When it comes to fertility difficulties and starting treatment, the law in the UK is really difficult. It's a grey area, and it's up to the manager's discretion whether you're allowed time off work. If you're struggling at work, I often say to my clients, go and see your GP, discuss it with the GP, and often I'll encourage people to go and get some time off work. Depending on what they're going through, obviously it's a very individual thing, and it's dependent on what stage they're at. But once we've done, if you have an IVF, for example, once we've done that embryo transfer, then you do fall under the legislation for pregnancy, and your rights are different, so you are entitled to time off work. So some individuals prefer not to tell managers, depends on the situation, but that can be difficult because then you're using up things like annual leave to attend hospital appointments, and you need your leave because you'll be exhausted with all that's going on, and it's important that you have that leave. So sometimes it's helpful, especially if you're feeling anxious or low, go and speak to your GP, get signed off for a period of time. If you're going through multiple rounds of treatment, cycles of treatment, then sometimes individuals will go to their GP and make sure that they're signed off for that actual full kind of cycle of treatment. So you might be signed off for several weeks at a time to help you to cope if you're feeling particularly anxious and depressed.
Just a thought occurred to me there. Does the GP generally write on the form fertility treatment stress, or do they just write stress as an umbrella term?
The GPs are often very good, and they'll keep the confidentiality, and they will often ask, what do you want me to write on this? And if you don't want fertility mentioned in it, then they're very good at saying it's stress, whatever you want to kind of put down, whatever you feel comfortable with. Because sometimes you might not have told your employers that you're having fertility treatment, so you're trying to keep it private. So the GPs are usually very, very good at ensuring that that's not shared if you don't want it to be shared. And obviously the treatments that we do are very confidential anyway, even within the hospitals, if it is a hospital. So thinking from an NHS point of view, we have another layer of confidentiality. So we're very, very sensitive to the confidentiality around it. And so are the GPs.
Okay, so it's important to say to your GP, look, I really don't want my boss to know all the ins and outs of this, and usually they will comply with that to try and keep your confidentiality for you. Okay.
I think can I just add in another point for that? I know certainly what we do in the unit here is if people need time off for a hospital appointment, then often they'll ask their managers for time off. And again, if they don't want anything around fertility on the letter, we often write hospital appointment and don't actually put fertility on it or anything to do with that. Again, so that we can keep the confidentiality. So most units are happy to do that. So if you just ask in your unit that you're attending, then they will do that to help you out, because we know what it's like. You want to keep it private.